My name is Gisela Kwok, and I'm the Director of the Provincial Disability Supports Initiative branch, which within the Disability Services Division of Alberta Human Services. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to today's webcast. This is the third in a new series of monthly webcasts, which we hope provides a forum for ongoing discussions of issues around meaningful and fulfilling employment for individuals with disabilities. As you may have heard, we have a new Associate Minister of Services for Persons with Disabilities. Minister Naresh Bhardwaj was appointed to the position on December the 6th, 2013. He wished to attend today and welcome you to this webcast in person. However, he had to be in Vanderbilt today, so he recorded a short message yesterday that we would like to play for you now.
Good afternoon. My name is Naresh Bhardwaj, Associate Minister of Services for Persons with Disabilities. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third Employment First webcast. Alberta is adopting an Employment First approach to help improve the lives of Albertans with disabilities. Employment gives us all a chance to learn new skills, build new relationships, feel more connected to our communities, and make more money. Employment First focuses on getting government, communities, and employers working together. By working together, we can welcome more Albertans with disabilities into our workplace. These Employment First webcasts help share information with employers, service providers, parents, and Albertans with disabilities. Today's topic will be of particular interest to the parents who work with children with disabilities. Today's webcast is on how parents and others can help children with disabilities prepare for their careers. This topic appeals to me because before I got elected, I was a teacher for 18 years. I had the opportunity to work with students who had disabilities. I knew they had the ability to have successful careers and to lead full and healthy lives. But I worried about what barriers might prevent them from realizing their full potential. In 2010, I was fortunate to chair the steering committee that setting the direction for inclusive education in Alberta. I'm excited to see Alberta is adopting an employment-first approach that mirrors the same inclusive principles. We can break down barriers for children with disabilities and help them build happy, satisfying lives. I hope you find this webcast interesting and informative, and I hope that you will join Employment First to improve the lives of all Albertans who are living with disabilities. Thank you very much.
As Minister Bhardwaj said, today's webcast is all about the career identity we all develop early on in life as young children. We've all been asked the question, and that's why we're here today to talk about what do you want to be when you grow up and how can we help. To explain the subtle importance of that question and how we can help children with disabilities prepare for their future careers, we're joined by three people with direct experience in the field. Bruce Uditsky is CEO of the Alberta Association for Community Living, an adjunct professor, Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies, Community Health Sciences, Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary. He's led and helped develop various initiatives, including the Rotary Employment Partnerships. He's won the Alberta Centennial Medal, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, and a Paul Harris Fellowship. Bruce is the parent of 2 adult children, one of whom has intellectual disabilities. Michelle Champagne-Berry is a program and policy advisor for Family Supports for Children with Disabilities branch within Alberta Human Services. She is an advocate of the life course approach and will explain why it is beneficial for families and community workers. Kelly Baldock is president of the Alberta Society for the Visually Impaired, and she sits on a consumer advocacy group for the CNIB. Kelly regularly meets with government to advise and develop position papers on accessibility for those with visual impairment. She has a daughter with visual impairment who's entering the world of post-secondary education. The discussion today will be moderated by Sharon Matthias, who has extensive experience in developing and consulting on public policy around services for First Nations and Aboriginal people, persons with disabilities, and health. I'll hand it off to Sharon now. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks for the introductions, Gisela. And I'm pleased to moderate our panel today with our esteemed panel. The first half of the discussion will be a panel discussion, a conversation with the panelists. And the last half we'll dedicate to questions and answers from you, the webcast audience. So as you're listening, if you have questions, if questions come to you, then please enter them in the chat window, and we will get to them in the question and answer period, and we'll answer as many of them as we can during the session today. Today's session is being recorded, and the video will be on the Human Services Employment First website. And Gisela will give you the address if you'd like to be on the mailing list. She'll give that at the end of the session. So let's turn to the panel. And Bruce, let's start with you first.
Sure.
You've been an advocate for a long time on getting started as soon as possible in helping people develop a career identity. In the policy world, the term that's used often is the life course approach, and they really do mean the same thing. So Bruce, maybe give a sense of what that life course approach means.
Okay, I'll try to do that. Essentially, it means looking at those of us without disabilities and how our career identity was literally forged almost from before birth onwards, and that it's such a normative process for those of us without disabilities that we literally, in effect, take it for granted and aren't particularly conscious about it. So from when parents are talking about what do you think our child will be when they grow up, to when relatives start to talk to the young children about, you know, what are your hopes and aspirations for the future. Kids are playing dress up at a very early age, acting out roles in our community, learning about community members, etc. And so what we find with children with disabilities is people begin to lose sight of possibilities, begin to narrow the gateway to options at a very early age, and begin to move kids with disabilities off those ordinary pathways that lead to a career identity. And the result of which is by the time they're adults, we're trying to put them back on that pathway, and we've lost out potentially on 18 or more years when they could have been having the same expectations and hopes and aspirations as others. So we have to work with families to have an expansive vision, to see the possibilities, identify the normative means by which people find employment later in life. So for example, high school employment that's available to many kids without disabilities is a very significant variable in whether or not you have a job after high school. And when we don't have supports and the means to enable kids with disabilities to have the very same experiences as their teenage peers, we again limit the possibilities for them to be successfully employed after high school, just by way of example.
Super, thank you. And so each stage of life then has appropriate, just as you would do with anybody, activities that help normalize that whole process.
Well, if you think about it, for most of us anyways, growing up to continue our education, for example, and have a career was not exactly an option. You didn't sit around the dinner table with your parents saying, well, whether or not you want to work is up to you, right? I don't, you know, in fact, we want you to work so you can support us later in life. So we're really, there's all these, in a sense, forces operating in our lives that are drawing us into the mainstream. And we want those same things to be available to kids with disabilities. So there has to be an expectation, first from those who love you the most, such as your family and parents, that your aspirations and hopes are going to be encouraged and are going to be realized, and that you'll continue on a pathway through schooling and through after-school activities, etc., all of which contributes to your career identity, figuring out what your passions and interests are. And to the greater degree we have the chance to pursue our passions, the more likely it is, in fact, we're going to be successfully employed.
Great. Now, Michelle, you develop programs, or you help develop programs within the provincial government's Family Support for Children with Disabilities, the FSCD branch. Tell us a little about what FSCD does. You can tell my mouth isn't working really well with that acronym. And from your perspective, why do you think it's important for families to start young?
Well, the FSCD program provides support to families who have a child with a disability, and that support can be referrals to resources, guidance, and access to resources and services that are specifically for children with disabilities. So assessments of need are completed to help understand what each individual family's support needs are, because they're going to differ from family to family and from child to child. And so that practice encourages those discussions beginning early on to explore what the child's interests are, what their strengths are, and ways that can be built upon. The services that are provided through FSCD are done so to help strengthen the family's ability to promote their child's development and encourage their child's participation in the home and in the community. And those things in turn support the child in achieving whatever goals it is that the family has or that they have for themselves.
So could you give me an example of what one of those visions might look like, sound like, for a family with a child?
Well, they're very varied, of course, according to where the child is or where the family is. They could be anything from, we really want to look at what we need to get done in the next month, to, we do have a vision for long term when our child is 18, just depending on where the family is. And so the FSCD workers try to respond to that and again help explore and expand upon what a family is articulating.
And are there other ways that the family finds that useful or beneficial to have such a vision or?
Sure. Well, having a clear vision can help families plan with intention, find those opportunities for experience and for growth, so to build upon those interests and those strengths, to make informed choices and also withstand pressures from others to not go down a path that isn't their own, or to settle for something different. So in essence, it can act like a compass to help guide a family towards what it is they want for their child. So FSCD workers will help families explore and understand that vision so that they can continue to do those things and benefit from those things. And they also help to identify the goals and the strategies that will help work towards that end. So it's that way to be deliberate in seeking a path to answer that question, what do you want to be or do when you're older?
Gotcha. So Bruce, how might this look, how might it play out in your work in AACL?
Well, what we do is we work individually with families, as well as providing seminars and workshops, and across the province, and from a very young age onward. And so we will sit down with a family, and potentially those are closest to the family and the child, and help them think about, and over the course of time, because it's not just one conversation essentially, to get a sense really of who this child is, so that they're seen first as a child and disability is secondary, or in a sense somewhere down the list if you want. And their identity is really about who they are as an individual. And then to help them think about possibilities. So by way of example, sometimes families are even unconscious of how they shut the doors down. And if you have a young child without disability, it's not unusual to thinking about how do we start saving for university or college. You have a child with significant intellectual or cognitive disabilities, you may stop thinking right away about that as an option, actually, not be aware of the fact that this is a distinct possibility. Forget how it is post-secondary education is almost essential to any of us today in terms of having valued opportunities for employment. And so without realizing it, you've sort of begun to narrow the possibilities. Maybe your child won't go on to university or college, because not everybody does, but when you start thinking about that this is a possibility, and I've unconsciously limited that, what else am I limiting for my child at such an early age? And so it provides families with the opportunity to open the doors and encourage their kids. So if they're talking at a young age, as many children still are, about I'm going to be a firefighter, a police officer, an ambulance driver, a doctor, etc., you don't discourage them and begin to think, gee, that's unrealistic. You encourage and support them to follow their ambitions, to have high expectations for themselves. And you have to remember, this is a field, if you want. So maybe they're not going to be a firefighter, but we do have people employed in fire and rescue, for example. We have people who have been employed in police services, people who are employed in medical environments, in manufacturing, etc. And so families first need to have their eyes opened to the possibilities, need to maintain those high expectations and aspirations, and then we help them to think about, well, what are the modifications, adaptations I need to make along the way to actually realize these options for my son or daughter. And increasingly, because we see young people with disabilities growing up in their neighborhoods, living at home, playing with their friends, going to school, and they see others going on to continue their education and have employment ambitions, they want the very same thing. And so today we actually see young people with developmental disabilities actually pushing their families along as they grow into later years of teenage and young adulthood. And that's really wonderful to be seeing today.
So Kelly, you've had to live this
Yes.
process yourself with your daughter when she was diagnosed with a visual impairment at a young age. Tell us about that early diagnosis and how you began to plan for her future.
Well, certainly it was it was a shock. We didn't have diagnosis at birth. We had it 3 months of age, and we had all kinds of horror stories prior to the diagnosis. So we were pretty happy with the diagnosis in the end, because we certainly had a worst case scenario than we thought. But really, for us, it was about a philosophy. It was about a mission. It was about where do we want to see the direction and how we want to raise our child. And thankfully, we already had one child. So we were pretty confident and comfortable with how our direction in raising him was. And we felt, why should we not compare our child with a disability and expect the same for her that we do for our son? So our goal was really to set the mission as being that we definitely wanted our child to stay within our community and to grow. This community was a very big part of our family. We've been in our community both our lives, my husband and I. It's really part of our identity, and we felt that was really, really important for her. Plus, we also believe in, strong academics, but we also believe in, if you're going to be a confident person who can interact with the world, you also need to know how to communicate. And you can't do that if you're in a community that's, miles away from the people you interact outside of school and outside of the education field, and outside of your peers and extracurricular activities. And how do you bring that home to follow that throughout their childhood years, right? So that was really our main philosophy and how we were going to achieve that. So in order to do that, we had to start with planning early and staying very strict and strategic on that planning. So the goal was to stay within the community school, which was not an easy feat because she was the only child with a visual impairment within the school setting. It was a very small school setting, a very Catholic school setting. So of course that was, led to, what do we do? How do we go? What do we, really we don't need your child should go to a district program where they're best suited and, resources can be shared, and she would get more out of that. So, you had to stay on that strict philosophy. We've done this all the way through, and I guess for me, to professionals and parents out there, the best advice that I could give is you're going to deviate off of the plan a lot, because policy changes. I sit back and I listen to Bruce and Michelle and I think, oh my goodness, I've been through FSCD, I'd say at least, 100 policy changes. So all of them great, all of them with great direction, and then all of a sudden a whole new policy comes into place. As well as, I've heard start planning your child's education early, and I've also fallen onto the, because your child's a disability, they'll have these services available to them when they're in post-secondary, and that no longer exists because it's now 12 years later.
Gotcha.
So just don't deviate off of your mission and your philosophy, because that itself should never change. If you want your child to be part of the community, you want them to get an education, you want them to be a contributing member of society, regardless if they have a disability or not, this is how you raise them, and this is how you encourage them, and this is how you make things possible for them.
Super. So now that she's getting ready to go to post-secondary, I don't know whether that's trades or university or college, so you might talk about that a little bit. But how does that planning help now?
Well, that planning helps none now, and that's what I mean by don't deviate from the philosophy or the mission, because what we believe to be what the plan was 4 years ago is no longer the plan, because along the way you're given well-intentioned advice that wasn't necessarily accurate, and when you get to that spot, all of a sudden you find out that you don't have the prereqs that you did and you needed. And that is, I guess, again, another part of life that you teach your child, that not everything is easy and in a box, and you got to work with it. as a parent, that's my role now to advocate, because I definitely think we need to change the way we structure and we help a family or a child within the school system with a disability. They need an advocate. They need somebody who's on the outside looking in. They need somebody who's not vested or invited or asked, or, you know, they're really there truthfully to help mold and help guide that child into independence, post-secondary, the workforce, what have you. But all the way through from school up into post-secondary and out into working in their own workforce.
Super. And Bruce, I appreciate that you help people with families with kids with disabilities, but you yourself have lived experience in this area as well. Can you tell us what it was like for you and your son?
Yeah, I can try to do that. And I couldn't agree more also with what Kelly has said. What we often say to families that lots of others say is, you don't have a clear vision for your child, others will. And so you need to maintain that in spite of the vagaries of what happens in life and systems and so on, so you don't lose sight of your way. In our situation, we already had a son of one child, and we wanted to expand our family. And so we always had the idea of adopting a child with special needs. Both my wife and I worked in the field. And so by chance, literally, we adopted our son, Todd, at the age of 7. And I think it's fair to say what I didn't understand at that time is that there were children in the child welfare system who were not considered adoptable. And he was considered too behaviorally difficult, too challenging, etc. And so there was no activity on his file, literally. And because I work in the field, that's how I got to meet him in a sense. And so we brought him into our life and learned in time that he had, besides developmental disabilities and a number of other challenges and a host of labels, also had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But as Kelly described, because we're committed to this philosophy and a set of values, although he hadn't had an inclusive life, he in fact hadn't had really a family life to that point in time. He'd lived in 7 different foster homes in 5 years. So even providing a sense, his identity, if you want, if we're talking about career identity, was I'm somebody nobody will want. I am somebody who can't be loved, right? He would gravitate to the margins, if you want, in terms he had such a negative sense of self-esteem, if you want, and identity. And so that was part of the challenge of trying to change that. But we worked to have him fully included in school, right through high school, with the commensurate challenges. And we had lots of challenges at home. We weren't familiar with children with individuals with FASD, and the strategies we knew weren't particularly effective with Todd. And it took us years to figure that out. He was very violent and aggressive during those years, but that's some time ago now, and it's almost like talking about a totally different person than who he is today. So he was fully included in our family life, traveled with us, skied with us, etc., and so on. And then I had helped to develop inclusive post-secondary education, started that, and even before I became a parent, so by chance or design, depending on how you look at it, he had the opportunity to be included at the University of Alberta. And then through the Rotary Employment Partnership that was mentioned earlier, had the opportunity to find employment. And to be honest, people told us we were unrealistic many times. And so we're either very persistent or stubborn or unrealistic, I guess. And so we pursued possibilities for him. We were told he wouldn't be able to work. It was too difficult. And he's been now employed over 8 years with the same manufacturing company, and with really little to no support actually on the job, almost full-time hours, and does work that we all depend on because he helps to build elevators, actually. And I think it's important to remember, many of us don't go through our daily activities thinking about how am I benefiting from the work and knowledge of somebody with a developmental disability. And he's just one example of many. I'll have to stop soon because I'm losing my voice. But I think the exciting part of it, besides going on to live in his own apartment, is that a couple of years ago he fell in love, met a young woman, and they became engaged recently. And this past summer, with the support of 2 families and their siblings, they were married. So from being in a sense literally lost in the system. I have some.
Oh, yeah.
Being lost in the system. I'm just trying not to interrupt my speaking. Being lost in the system to finding a family by chance to pursuing an inclusive normative pathway, lots of hopes and expectations, and you know, now he has an income to support himself and his wife. And it's not that he doesn't continue to need some support from us and others, but he has a life. In fact, hardly anyone who knew him at that time in his life would have imagined or would have set him on the path to this possibility. And that's the difference this approach can make in someone's life.
I'm intrigued by the comment, I think it was you, Michelle, that made earlier about you need a vision so you can kind of keep other people from tampering with it. And it seems from all of you that that's been a large part of the process. So those of us who are community members need to understand too that we can help or hinder this process just by casual comments that we might say, or even facial expressions, I suspect, if I asked you more deep questions. But what I hear is that aside from persistence, which is clearly part of the puzzle, having a plan, or more precisely a vision, made it a little easier to know what actions to take, but also how to adjust along the way. And so do you have insights for parents particularly about how to make those adjustments, how to know you've got to make them, and how you deal with the grief sometimes of having to let go a very passionate idea about what was going to happen? Kelly, maybe we start with you?
You know, I think again it just comes back to just consistently you have to kind of know what your beliefs and your belief systems are, and then it seemed to help make the decisions as to what was right or wrong for your family. I don't know that that's something that you can necessarily learn. I mean, certainly I had guidance along the way. I mean, we had early education and early intervention for our child. We had really good workers originally when working with our child who helped mold and make it that we were on a path to our belief, which then helps you to become a good advocate for your child, is really, I think, the best way that I can explain.
The other thing I was struck with, you said before, that your vision wasn't about a prescribed outcome. You didn't say she's going to be, you know, a cardiac care nurse who does this, that, and the other thing. You had a set of principles around which you could design particular activities. Is that reasonable?
It is very reasonable, and it's really kind of my philosophy on being a parent. I never wanted to put expectations on my daughter that she had ever at one point felt that she couldn't attain or reach. I didn't want to do that for my son, so why should I do that for my daughter? So the philosophy that we taught her was that the expectation is you are going to be independent, you are going to get a job, or you're going to get an education, and then you're going to get a job. And how that works is completely up to you and how hard you're going to put into it, but there is no other option in our home. You are going to do these things. We're here to support you, to help you get there, but that was the expectation at a very young age.
Great. Bruce?
Well, I think what I would add at this point is the importance of knowing that this is a very difficult road for all families to walk by themselves, actually. And in some ways it's almost countercultural, as you were saying, Sharon, in that the rest of society doesn't necessarily understand this and has their own assumptions about the place of people with disabilities in community. And so in a sense you're always pushing uphill, if you want. And so it's very important for families to be connected to each other, to be places where they have advocacy support that was mentioned earlier, and not have to walk this path alone, because it's easy for any of us, if you want, to lose our way along this process. So I don't want to leave the impression that everybody figures this out on their own, and that we need each other, as well as those in our business community, schools and teachers and others, to support this vision and the path that people want to choose. Essentially the same as anyone else, with the appropriate modifications and adaptations along the way.
Just if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to add to what Bruce
Sure.
is saying, that definitely was an integral part for us. That was how I started with my relationship with the Alberta Society for the Visually Impaired. It's a parent organization, and you were able to talk to parents and professionals and people working with kids who had visual impairments. So sometimes it wasn't always just hearing the right things and the right philosophies that they were raising their children, but was also hearing the wrong things. So I may not like the way that goes, you know, how you're approaching a certain thing that way. So that's great, because that helped solidify my philosophy and my path. So Bruce is very much right. You can't do it alone, because, you know, you run out of wind in your sails. You run out of, you're often, you know, faced with, am I making the right choices? Am I doing the right thing? I mean, that's a lot of responsibility on a parent for the future of a child with a disability.
And I'm going to come to Michelle in a minute and ask about what all that means in terms of implications for policy kinds of actions. But in the meantime, for those of you in the audience, certainly send in your questions. Just type them into the chat bar, and we'll bring them onto the deck for the panelists to answer. If you have a particular panelist that you'd like to take a stab at your question, then please specify that. And so, but in the meantime, we'll just carry on here. So Michelle, it seems to me that policy over the years has done a lot of good things, but one of the things it hasn't been so good at is this kind of mid-course adjustment sorts of process that I hear these guys say is so important. I might be wrong, but I'd like your observation on that.
I think from the perspective of FSCD, and I've been in the program for about 8 or 9 years, so just even the course that I've taken within the program, as a worker representing the program and the kind of the policy side, you don't talk to the families on as regular basis as you might want to, or it's not the same piece of a network for the family as creating the network that like Kelly's talking about, right? So an FSCD worker or kind of a government or that policy person is part of your team, part of your network, and there to support you and provide you with that guidance and direction and backing. But it's not the same as talking with a family about building that network, right, and having that foundational network that they can rely on a regular basis. So I think from the policy side, we've tried to recognize what families are saying is important. So planning early, recognizing having a vision, and that it's the family's vision that they're working towards. So honoring that, honoring the vision, supporting the family and working towards it, and helping them understand that things will change. Their ideas will change, and we can change with them, right? What we do doesn't have to be static. If a family decides to go in a different direction, that we can respond to that. So I think that the policy being free enough to respond to families' needs, as varied as they are, and as things change for each family is important, and we've tried to recognize that.
Oh, sir. Great. It strikes me that lots of what you've talked about is really good parenting. And so I wonder if some of the things you've learned you might consider writing them up and distributing them as a guide for everybody.
Can I say that I actually use what I hear from parents with my 3-year-old daughter? Who, it's the same principles apply, and I look at where I want to go with my daughter, and all the things I hear Kelly saying, I hear Bruce saying, it's the same principles. Having that vision, understanding the direction you want to go, knowing that along the way there's going to be choices to be made, and you might have to choose between 2 things, and neither one of them is your ideal, but having that compass, having that guide is going to help you decide between those 2 options that you do have. And so I take what I learned from families and I use it.
Oh, interesting.
And Bruce would probably be the first to admit that there are probably moments that were less than savory or shining moments when you're a parent advocating for your child. And that's not a bad lesson for your child to learn, is that mom or dad isn't always perfect, and we fall off of our pedestals every now and then.
I think if you asked my sons, they'd have a different idea.
Oh yeah, same with my children too.
Yes, but we do have at the association lots of resources available for families, as well as connecting families to each other in workshops and seminars. So we have a booklet on how to foster a career development from an early age onward, for example, information on the pathway to inclusive post-secondary and employment, etc. The resources are available. You can search them online. You can't read them necessarily online, but you can borrow them for free, and many of them are available
Great.
for free. So I'd encourage any family that's interested in wanting to know how to pursue these ideas further. That would be a way to do it, rather than asking me for parenting advice, for example, which would not be a good idea.
And is there a website name, or what's the?
Yes, for us the website is www. Is that three? .aacl.org.
.org.
.org. Yeah.
And Kelly, do you have anything with?
Yeah, really, we do the same, similar with the Alberta Society for the Visually Impaired. We have conferences. We have one coming up March 14th and 15th, and really it's about parent and professional networking. You know, I like to see the expanse of that youth get together and children get together and talk to one another, because they're certainly, you know, they learn from one another. You know, the one thing that I will say that I like what I hear here is that I think one of the approaches, there still needs to be lots of change. There still needs to be, you know, a different direction and policy. I mean, I think interministerial is important right at this point in time. I think that health, education, and children's services need to come together. And I think if we pooled all those resources and really supported the child and the family, we would see those unemployment numbers decrease dramatically. You know, call me back in 6 months, because I'm sure I'll have plenty of other ideas as I'm going through the post-secondary process. I'm already frightened.
Well, Tina, is there any questions from the website?
We have two so far, and actually they're FSCD related. So they're for Michelle. So Rhonda asks, are FSCD workers trained in career development, or would they refer the family to Human Services CECs?
Sure. FSCD workers come from a variety of backgrounds. So some may have a stronger background specifically in supporting the employment piece. Not all will. So absolutely, they would make referrals to whether it's CECs or employment organizations or other support organizations like AACL, whatever's available in the community. That's going to be the right support for the family to achieve that, to get that support.
And the second one is also again about FSCD. So San asks, do the FSCD workers provide either supports and services in the area of employment supports, such as job coaching and specialized assessments? Because San says often supports go with a diagnosed disability.
I'm not sure what the last part means, but the supports and services available directly through FSCD are not necessarily intended to work specifically on employment. Some of the supports and services may be used in indirectly in that way, but again, FSCD would refer families to programs that do have those specific supports, and we find that more and more those are popping up in the community and in various communities across the province. So we're trying to start to make connections with those programs as well, and have those opportunities to connect parents to those.
One of the things I'd ask the questioner to clarify is, what age are you thinking of? Because FSCD supports families up to
the age of 18.
18.
Right.
And so there would be a transition process then into another variety of government programs, including the Alberta Works DRES program, which would have those kinds of supports. So partly it depends on what age you're asking about.
And what the needs of the youth are.
And what the needs
Right.
of the youth. Thank you.
I think one of the values of FSCD is, in fact, at times its flexibility. So if I'm a family and I have access, for example, to a developmental aid or a community inclusion aid, for example, I could utilize that support if it's necessary, and this isn't for every child, but in order to be, included in after-school activities, right? Extracurricular activities, recreational, leisure activities, all of which in fact contribute to the totality of a career identity. Could even potentially use that later in teenage years, in fact, for whether one could be in scouts or to support them in police cadets, etc. All of which are part of life that leads you on to employment, and even to supporting people in part-time jobs. The challenge with that is it leaves it entirely almost to the creativity of families to figure out how to do that. And that's where you need the connection of others I think to maximally benefit, FSCD is one of the best programs in the country. But in order to, I think, maximize its potential, you need these connections to see what have other people figured out in utilizing FSCD resources, for example. And to go back to Kelly's point, because I don't want to leave it actually, the partner that we have to get most on board on the moment in terms of this approach to trying to increase employment for people with disabilities is education. And the Associate Minister referenced his role in chairing the committee that was looking at setting the direction and so on, and we still have to see that direction realized so that an inclusive education is actually an ordinary request of families, not one more challenge they have to face in raising a child with disabilities. So we need our partners, if you want, to come more fully around this approach to a life pathway, to a valued life as an adult.
And sorry, just to add to that, the philosophy has to stay consistent, because part of the challenge for many parents and many organizations is accessing services. So, for instance, a child with a vision loss is considered low incident population. So an FSCD worker, though well-intentioned, and I mean we've had a fabulous one up until December 13th at midnight when my daughter turned 18 and the floor was pulled out, had very limited experience with a child who had low vision. So I think if we go back to the core value of building a family, you should look at the core value of employing a child with a disability early on as being everybody's issue and regardless of the disability. You know, there's always numbers in children with autism and, you know, whatever other disability out there, but when it's a low incidence population, a lot of people put their hands up and go, I don't have the experience or the knowledge, or what do I do, or how do we facilitate that? Really, the philosophy doesn't change. It's still a child with a disability who will require employment at some point and stage in their life.
And do you, I wanted to come back to your comment about human services, education, and health having a cross-ministerial approach. The other thing that occurred to me that's part of the puzzle is surely, and am I being naive with this question? I'm prepared to be naive if you tell, and Bruce knows me well enough to know that he can say that. Is there benefit to having sharing resources or connecting somehow the incredible depth of knowledge that each disability group has with the particular aspects of their own disability? Like you talked about visual impairment, you talked about realizing that FAS required some different strategies. Is that part of the puzzle too, is finding a way to work better across the various disability groups?
I think it's clearly part of it, and almost everything we do today requires partnerships. The world is pretty complex and challenging, and to make advances we require partnerships with the business community, with Rotary clubs, with post-secondary institutions, but it's those partnerships, in fact, with community that I think provide for the greatest advantage. So to the degree that the disability community can speak more with one voice, shares information and knowledge is great, but we still have to be able to engage the community in that partnership to see not just its shared responsibility as integral to the well-being of our community in general, but also the benefits that are derived from, for example, having a child with disability in a regular classroom or in the regular workforce.
Sure.
And we have many employers, actually, quite a lot, who will speak today quite eloquently and passionately about how their workplace or workshop floor changed to the better as a result of having somebody with a disability, people learning to be more respectful of each other's differences, learning to see that there are other ways of looking at the world and what's really important, etc. And that results in a better work environment, which results in better productivity and outcomes.
And I think that has to be the responsibility of not just, I think when I'm talking interministerial, I'm talking paid positions that help make that connection. Because one of the big challenges of being what I think Bruce and I very much could be is experts within our child's disability. But being that strong advocate, being that person who is seeking knowledge and connection and community connection and parent connection and also advocacy to make better for children coming up, you're exhausted. You don't
Yes.
have time at the end of the day. If you've got a full-time job, you're supporting a family, you're still the mom or dad of another child who requires attention, you're in a marriage. I mean, all of that, you can't coordinate that all well together. I think there needs to be that approach where it's in a professional, environment that helps keep all of that, the cogs and wheels turning, because you can't rely on volunteers and parents strictly to make that happen.
Gotcha. I see.
And I think with the FSCD piece as well, I mean, again, workers come to our program with a variety of backgrounds. So some might have really strong backgrounds in specific disabilities or not, in specific areas like employment or not. But again, the value of the FSCD program is that we honor the parents as the experts. The experts of their child, and as you've become, Kelly and Bruce, the experts of the disability and what that means for your children. So I think that the planning piece that FSCD supports with families is, again, looking at what is your vision. Let's help you explore that and expand on that and work towards it. So what can we do to help support work towards that, right? You bring your expertise to the table and let us know what it is you need, and we'll try and help support that. And so that's where our planning comes into place, valuing the family's vision and saying, okay, we might have some supports and services that can help a community inclusion support if your child is younger and wanting to explore certain interests and activities, and then as they get older, wanting to maybe explore certain opportunities, whether it's volunteerism, that sort of thing, if they can be of that help. So FSCD worker, what their role is to look at where are we at, what goals are we trying to achieve, and what kind of support can we help get you there. You're the expert, and there's a whole other network of people around you to help support you with that. How can we help coordinate with all of that and help fill in some of those holes where support is needed? So if that helps clarify.
So FSCD is a part of the puzzle, but doesn't try to be one of the system navigator or other kinds of roles that I hear, some way to connect all the pieces together. That's kind of what seems to be missing.
As much as possible, but knowing that we don't have all the resources and answers either, right? We have to partner with families and with the rest of the community resources that are available.
There's no driver. The only driver is the parent. And that parent has to be able to be savvy enough to phone, FSCD and phone health and phone education. Now imagine if you had a worker like Michelle who said, listen, okay, what is your values? Where do you want you and your family and your child with a disability to go in the future? And then her speak to the person who's in charge of your child's education, and then speak to all of the people that are in charge of her health, and pulling all of those together so that I don't need to get a note from my doctor every year to get her back in school, or to get an IPP done, or to get into this program or this community thing or white cane instruction. Just imagine one person at that hub working as a really well-oiled machine.
Or minimally some of that work happening behind the scenes so that it's not upon the parent to have to do it.
Gotcha.
Yes. The notion of a navigator is not new. And there are other systems in other parts of the world that have tried it. And we've actually tried it in Alberta context, in fact. But we, like so many other things, the policies, as Kelly said, change, and we're not able to get funding to drive it and sustain it in spite of positive results. So this is a constant refrain from families about how do I negotiate and find my way through all of this. It's in a way, we make it look relatively clear in the sense of maybe developing a vision, but in the fact you're trying to find your way down a maze.
Yes, yes.
And you need both to have the clarity, the vision, the way to facilitate a normative pathway, an inclusive pathway through community life, but at the same time you're dealing potentially with all kinds of systems that are intersecting with that, and with things that life throws up ordinarily.
Absolutely.
And so having a navigator who's really not bound by allegiances to a system, but only bound by allegiance to the family and a value positive and the child and a vision, can really move things along. But we have to be prepared to invest in that, and probably not invest in some, given limited resources, some other things that we do from time to time. And just by way of one, I think, encouraging example, to balance things off a little bit, until the advent of human services in the department, we really couldn't get a focus on the transition to employment for youth with disabilities. Because it wasn't employment department's responsibilities, it wasn't social services responsibilities, etc. And so there'd be this huge systems gap in trying to figure out how to support and facilitate a transition to employment from 16 on upwards. Now we have a department that has the potential and is beginning to invest in that approach. And I'm optimistic, actually, or hopeful rather, that it will lead to promising outcomes, and we'll see greater investment in young people with disabilities having a chance to secure employment, and we're expanding inclusive post-secondary education opportunities, and all of that contributes, I think, down the road to employment, because what we're setting up now in the first 18 years of life is somehow supposed to enable you for the next 50 or 60 years of your life. So it's incumbent upon us to get it as right as we possibly can during those years.
I think all my policy work really kind of, lots of it centers around this particular issue of transitions, that we have lots of things in their own particular island or whatever, but the links between them, the transitions from one to the other, are what we haven't done well, not just in the world of disabilities, but in lots of other things. So let's turn to another question from the audience.
So one question. Hello to each of you. Thank you for being here. I would love to hear from each of you about the process that seems to be most effective in supporting our sons and daughters find and keep work.
Sorry, what was the end of that?
They'd like to hear from each of you about the process that works best to help people find and keep work.
To find and keep work. When you're working in the 0 to 18-year-old range, or because that's the focus today. They don't say.
Still,
why don't you talk about that, Bruce?
what works best doesn't work always for everybody. So we're talking in generalities, right? It might be different if it was a specific individual. What we know works best, in fact, is having relationships and being part of a network. Only about 30% of jobs are actually advertised. So 70% of jobs aren't advertised. And most of us without disabilities find our employment actually through our networks, really, through word of mouth, through who recommend us, through who knows somebody, etc. And when young people with disabilities don't have that same network around their lives, they're at an disadvantage with respect to a host of things around maybe perceptions of disability, etc., but also because they don't have this network to tap into. So anything you can do as a parent, and it's not guaranteed, it's a pathway to try to pursue, to facilitate relationships, belonging, participation with others without disabilities in particular, increases the probability of being able to tap a network, including your own network as a family, for employment possibilities. And then in terms of sustaining it, what works best, again, talking generalities, is figuring out how to facilitate, our jargon is natural supports. To the greatest degree we can have somebody supported as much as possible, as naturally as possible by colleagues and coworkers, tends to result in greater sustained employment if we minimize the degree needed for paid support. Now, some people will only be able to be successful with paid support, and we want to make sure those people that need that have that. But too often we've relied on paid support, which in fact creates a bit of distance between the employee with disabilities and their colleagues, and that distance can result in some challenges. The other is whenever there's a transition in the workplace, that often creates a point of vulnerability for people with disabilities. Change in manager or supervisor, for example, a change in what equipment you're going to be using. And so if you can identify that and know when those points of change are happening, you have a chance to try to smooth that smooth that out. So a new manager comes in and wonders, why do we have this person with a disability in this sector and doing this job? Or we have new equipment and we're not sure how to adapt it. Or the job demands are changed in that unit, for example. Those changes, without some capacity to sometimes smooth them over, creates a point of vulnerability. And we just want to be able to pay attention to those so that we minimize the risk people have of losing their employment. We just had somebody at risk because the business they were working in was sold, and the new owner isn't sure they want to keep on somebody with a disability, although they're prepared to keep on all the other employees.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of thing we need to pay attention to.
And sadly enough, I don't have a lot to offer because we were on our philosophy and our mission to raise a child who had post-secondary education and then get a job. And only in the last 2 years have I been exploring what that's going to look like. And unfortunately, the statistics are quite poor for people with visual impairments and getting a job within the workforce. It's well over 50% of people unemployed who are blind or visually impaired. That in itself, I think, is the statement.
Mm.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
And Kelly, were you exploring ways in which your daughter could do after school work or other sorts of things
Yeah.
at school? Was that challenging as well?
That was absolutely challenging to the point of actually having to give that up, because obviously she's visually impaired, so the challenge to academically keep up was difficult.
Ah, yes, right.
So in order, and for our child, her vision fluctuates throughout the day. So towards the end of the day, her vision is quite poor. So right after school, if there was any homework that needed to be completed, it needed to be done fairly soon.
Yes.
Or she was not capable of completing it later.
Gotcha.
So we did try, work experience, but that was something that education didn't want to handle because that was not their responsibility.
Right.
Plus, there was a lot more risk to having a child in the education system going to work at a potentially, McDonald's or Tim Hortons, so who's going to be accountable should something happen to that child? The school or the workplace? So it became a matter of let's focus on your academics and then we'll worry about that later. Which is again one of those decisions as a parent that you wonder, was it a right one or was it a wrong one?
I got a few of those myself.
Yeah.
Kind of hard to avoid.
Yeah.
I think, though, the reality is that we have this vast, underutilized, untapped labor force in our province and across our country, and it's almost, in a sense, shameful the degree to which we're wasting this human potential.
Yes.
And so it requires, as we've said earlier, all of us to come together to figure out how the dreams of people like our sons and daughters, in fact, can be realized, and they don't continue to remain on the margin. So it does, in fact, their significant degree of unemployment and underemployment does cost us from real money to social costs.
Great.
And it requires that partnership with education, business world, families, etc., to change that current reality to one actually that's a much more positive future.
With the youth we're raising nowadays, as far as how much they value a job and minimum wage, you're really going to need our children. Because I'll tell you, I don't know about your son, Bruce, but my daughter takes the job very seriously.
Seriously. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful wrap-up and transition to Gisela to finish up for us.
A big thank you to our panelists, Bruce, Kelly, and Michelle, for generously sharing your experiences and insights with us. And to all of you who tuned in for this session, we're grateful you spent the hour with us. We hope it's been informative and inspiring. As we mentioned in the opening, this webcast is part of a regular monthly series we're hosting the third week of each month. To get updates and registration information about each of these sessions, please subscribe to our mailing list by emailing hs.employmentfirst@gov.ab.ca. As mentioned earlier, today's webcast was recorded and the video will be posted online along with videos from all the previous webcasts. If you sign up for the mailing list, the video link will be sent out to you automatically. We encourage you to share this video with anyone you think may be interested. As well, if you have topic ideas you'd like to pursue or feedback about today's webcast, please email us at the same email address and let us know. We love to hear from you. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.